The notice was taped to my door like a warning from someone who had already decided my life did not matter. I still remember the sound of my wheelchair stopping against the small wooden edge that was supposed to be my ramp, a simple piece of freedom I had built with my own hands after months of saving and planning, but that morning it felt like a wall higher than anything I had ever faced. The paper shook in my hand as I read it again and again. HOA violation, unauthorized structure, immediate removal required or fines will begin daily. It was not just wood they were asking me to remove, it was my independence, my ability to leave my own home without asking for help, my dignity. I looked across the street and saw her standing there perfectly still, watching me like she had been waiting for this moment. The HOA president, Mrs. Carter, arms folded, face cold, not even pretending to care. She did not wave, she did not smile, she just nodded slightly like she had already won. That was the moment something inside me cracked. Because this was not the first time. It started weeks earlier when I submitted the request, polite, detailed, with measurements, photos, and even doctor notes explaining why I needed the ramp. I followed every rule, filled every form, waited patiently like they tell you to do. They ignored it. Then they delayed it. Then they rejected it. No clear reason, just a vague line about neighborhood aesthetics. Aesthetics. Like my ability to move was somehow less important than how their sidewalk looked. So I built it anyway. Quietly, legally, within my property line, with proper materials, no shortcuts, no risks, just a clean, safe ramp that let me roll out of my house without fear. For the first time in years I could leave without calling someone for help. I could feel normal again. And that lasted exactly 3 days. 3 days before that notice appeared. 3 days before Mrs. Carter decided my life was an inconvenience. I tried to talk to her that same afternoon, rolling across the street with every ounce of patience I had left. I explained everything again, calmly, clearly, respectfully. She listened with that same cold expression, then said something I will never forget. Rules are rules. That was it. No empathy, no hesitation, just rules. I asked her if she understood what she was asking me to do. She said, if you remove it now we can avoid fines. Like she was doing me a favor. I went back home that day feeling smaller than I had ever felt before. But that night something changed. Because as I sat there staring at that ramp, I realized something. They wanted me to give up quietly. They expected me to fold. They thought I had no choice. And they were wrong. The next morning I made a call that would change everything. A call that would turn their perfect little neighborhood upside down. And Mrs. Carter had no idea what was coming next. The man on the phone did not sound impressed at first. His voice was calm, almost distant, as he asked me to explain everything again from the beginning, and I did not rush this time. I told him about the forms, the rejection, the ramp, the notice, and the way they kept hiding behind rules while ignoring what those rules were doing to me. There was a long silence after I finished. Then he asked one question that made my heart start beating faster. Did they offer you any reasonable alternative? I said no. Another pause, longer this time. Then his tone changed completely. That should not have happened. His name was Daniel Reyes, and he was not just any lawyer. He specialized in cases like mine, cases where people thought rules were more important than rights. He told me something I had never fully realized before. What they were doing might not just be unfair, it might be illegal. For the first time since that notice appeared, I felt something different. Hope. He asked me to send every document, every email, every photo, and I stayed up that entire night scanning everything, making sure nothing was missing, because something told me this was bigger than just a ramp. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. No new notices, no fines, no visits from Mrs. Carter. It felt like the calm before something massive. Then Daniel called me again. His voice was sharper, this time focused. We are filing a complaint. I asked him what that meant exactly. He said it meant they would not be able to ignore this anymore. It meant someone with real authority would start asking questions. And most importantly, it meant this was no longer just between me and the HOA. It was about to become something much bigger. Within a week everything started moving fast. Letters were sent, official ones, not the kind you can just tape to someone's door and forget. These had weight behind them. The HOA board suddenly wanted a meeting. Mrs. Carter, who could barely spare a sentence for me before, was now asking for discussions. But something had changed in me. I was done begging. When I entered that meeting room, every eye was on me. Not with sympathy but with tension. They knew this was no longer simple. Mrs. Carter tried to keep control, speaking about community standards, property values and consistency, but her voice was not as steady as before. Daniel sat beside me, calm, confident, letting her talk. Then he placed a single document on the table. Everything went silent. Because that paper was not just another complaint. It was the beginning of something they could not control anymore. And when Mrs. Carter finally read the first few lines, her face lost that certainty for the very first time. But even then she made one mistake. She still thought she could win. She had no idea that someone far more powerful than any HOA board was already paying attention to this case. And soon they would show up in a way none of us expected. The letter changed everything. Not slowly, not quietly, but all at once. Within days, the neighborhood that once ignored me started watching my house like something important was about to happen. Cars slowed down when they passed, people whispered from their lawns, and every time I rolled outside I could feel the shift. This was no longer just about a ramp. It had become a problem. For them. The HOA called for another meeting, this time urgent, mandatory attendance, the kind of meeting they only hold when something is slipping out of their control. Daniel told me to stay calm and say nothing unless necessary. So I went and I watched. Mrs. Carter stood at the front again, but this time she looked different. Still dressed perfectly, still holding her posture, but there was something underneath it, tension, cracks forming behind that controlled expression. She started speaking about misunderstandings and cooperation, about finding solutions that work for everyone. It almost sounded reasonable. If you did not know what she had already done. Then one of the board members interrupted her quietly, asking about the letter. The room shifted instantly. Because that letter was not just from a lawyer. It carried something else, something heavier. Daniel stood up slowly and slid a copy across the table for everyone to see. No long speech, no dramatic tone, just calm certainty. This is a formal notice of violation of federal accessibility law. The words hung in the air like a storm about to break. Someone at the back actually whispered federal. Mrs. Carter tried to respond, but her voice hesitated just for a second. She said they were a private community and had their own rules. Daniel nodded like he expected that. Then he said something that made the entire room go silent. Private rules do not override federal rights. That was the moment everything shifted. You could feel it. The confidence draining from the board, the quiet panic spreading across their faces. Because this was no longer about neighborhood aesthetics or small fines. This was about something they could not ignore. Something that could bring consequences far beyond their control. The meeting ended quickly after that. No decisions, no resolution, just uncertainty. But outside that room, something even bigger was already in motion. 2 days later, a black car pulled up in front of Mrs. Carter's house early in the morning. Not the kind of car you see visiting casually. Clean, official, silent. People noticed immediately. Curtains moved, doors opened just enough for eyes to peek through. I was by my window when I saw it. And then I saw him step out. A man in a dark suit, calm, composed, carrying nothing but authority in the way he walked. He did not knock. He stepped straight onto her lawn. And in that moment something told me. This was the beginning of the end for her control over this entire situation. Because the kind of attention she had tried so hard to avoid had finally arrived at her doorstep. The moment he stepped onto her lawn, everything stopped. The usual morning noise, birds, cars, distant voices, all of it faded like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Mrs. Carter opened her door with the same controlled posture she always had, but the second she saw him, that control slipped just enough to reveal the fear underneath. He introduced himself calmly, clearly, and there was no need to raise his voice because the authority in his presence said everything. He was not there to argue. He was there to act. Within minutes more people had gathered, not close enough to interfere but close enough to witness something they never expected to see in their quiet, controlled community. Documents were presented, questions were asked, and for the first time Mrs. Carter was not the one in charge. She tried to explain policies, procedures, community standards, but every word sounded weaker than the last. Because none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was simple. They had ignored a basic right. They had chosen appearance over accessibility. And now they were being held accountable. Later that day the HOA sent out an emergency notice to all residents. The tone was completely different from before. No threats, no fines, no authority. Just compliance. Immediate approval of accessibility modifications. Removal of all penalties issued to me. And a formal apology. But the most powerful moment came that evening. When Mrs. Carter herself walked across the street. No crowd, no audience, just her standing in front of my home, looking smaller than I had ever seen her before. She did not hold her usual confidence. She did not speak like she was above anything. She simply said she was sorry. Not for the rules. Not for the misunderstanding. But for what she had done. I looked at my ramp, the same one they tried to take away. And for the first time it felt like more than wood and nails. It felt like proof. Proof that standing your ground matters. Proof that silence only helps those in power. Proof that even in a place where rules seem absolute, they are not above what is right. The neighborhood changed after that. Not overnight, but enough to notice. People who once looked away now nodded when they passed. Small gestures but real ones. And as for Mrs. Carter, she never held that same power again. Because once authority is challenged by truth, it never looks the same. And every time I roll down that ramp, I remember exactly what it took to keep it there.